Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really focusing in on a pretty intense moment around the conflict in Ukraine. We've got sources that put us right at this crossroads where you see some really high stakes, almost geopolitical talk clashing with what's actually happening day to day on the ground.
That's exactly right. That's the mission today. We're kind of unpacking a briefing that shows these two narratives happening at the same time. On one hand, you've got this intense diplomatic pressure focused on the future, really, about U.S. weapons policy. Specifically, this, pretty unprecedented public talk about sending long-range Tomahawk missiles.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have Moscow's response, not necessarily in words, but in actions, which is this ongoing and actually escalating campaign of aerial attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure.
So our goal here is to try and weave those two threads together for you, so you can understand not just, the headlines, but maybe the potential consequences of escalating both the threats and the actual physical attack simultaneously. Let's start with that first part, the rhetoric, the Tomahawk threshold, as we're calling it.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here is that this specific threat, it comes from former President Donald Trump, and it seems to follow up on some private discussions he'd had. He mentioned this to reporters while on Air Force One, saying he'd been, quote, mulling sending these long-range weapons to Kyiv.
And the timing is key here, isn't it? This came after that meeting with Putin in Alaska didn't result in any kind of peace deal.
Exactly. That's the stated context. That the August meeting didn't yield anything, so this consideration apparently started then.
And he wasn't subtle about it. This wasn't framed as just another option. He put it out there as a direct threat, right? A way to escalate things massively.
Absolutely. The quote attributed to him is telling Putin, look, if this war is not going to get settled, I'm going to send them Tomahawks. And he himself called it a new step of aggression.
Okay, but maybe we should clarify for listeners, what is a Tomahawk exactly? Why is sending these such a bigger deal, such a leap, compared to other weapons Ukraine might already have?
That's crucial, yeah. Understanding why this specific weapon carries so much weight. So fundamentally, the Tomahawk is a long-range cruise missile. It can be launched from ships, subs, even aircraft in some variants, and it flies hundreds of miles. It's designed for precision strikes deep inside enemy territory.
So much further than things like ATACMS.
Much further. And it's a cruise missile, so it flies low, harder to detect sometimes. ATACMS are tactical ballistic missiles, very useful. Ukraine has them once more, but they're shorter range. Giving Ukraine Tomahawks, well, that potentially gives Kyiv a real strategic deep strike capability. They could credibly threaten important military targets inside Russia itself, far from the front lines, and that's why Moscow sees it as crossing such a significant line.
Okay, so with that kind of potential impact, Kyiv's reaction makes a lot more sense. They're pushing for this.
Oh, absolutely. President Zelenskyy confirmed he actually requested Tomahawks in a recent call. He told the Sunday briefing, one of our sources, that he was, quote, waiting for President to yes, and confirmed they were working on it. And it's not just Tomahawks. He also confirmed they're talking about getting more of other long-range precision weapons, specifically mentioning more ATACMS.
So the push for longer reach is definitely real, even if the Tomahawk is the sort of headline grabber.
Exactly. The demand for any deep strike capability is urgent from Kyiv's perspective.
So what about Moscow? What was the official Kremlin line on this very public threat about a strategic weapon? Because even if it's just talk for now, it has to factor into their planning, right?
It does. And the reaction was swift. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov voiced, quote, extreme concern. He said, the topic of Tomahawks is of extreme concern, and stressed that now is really a very dramatic moment in terms of the fact that tensions are escalating from all sides.
Extreme concern. That's pretty strong language.
It signals they are taking the possibility seriously, regardless of the source of the threat, because, as we said, it fundamentally changes the military equation for them. If Ukraine gets that kind of reach, Russia has to rethink where it places its own valuable assets, command centers, logistics hubs, push them further back.
Which sets up this really interesting counterpoint we found in the sources. Because one of Russia's closest allies is kind of downplaying the whole thing.
Yeah, that's Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. He spoke to Russian state media, and his take was basically, don't take this literally. He suggested Trump's approach is known to, take a more forceful approach, and then his tactic is to let go a little and step back.
So Lukashenko sees it as maybe just political theater. A negotiation tactic.
That seems to be his interpretation, yes.
So if we look at it through that lens, does it hold water? I mean, does this kind of very public high-stakes talk about future weapons actually work as leverage? Or does it maybe risk just sort of normalizing escalation talk without actually delivering the aid Ukraine needs right now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If it is just leverage, maybe it pressures Moscow a bit. But it could also sow confusion, maybe even distrust among allies waiting for concrete support. On the other hand, if you take the timeline seriously, the threat coming after failed peace talks, then maybe it works as a signal that the U.S. does have other bigger cards it could play down the line. But the problem is, focusing on future strategic weapons, whether it's leverage or a real plan, kind of ignores the immediate reality, doesn't it?
Right. Exactly. While this geopolitical game plays out in the headlines over potential future weapons, what's happening now? Let's shift to that second track, Russia's ongoing campaign against Ukraine's critical infrastructure, especially with winter coming.
Yeah, this is where the sources bring us right back to the present. And it's pretty grim. Russia is clearly intensifying efforts to damage Ukraine's energy system before the cold really sets in. It's become a key battleground, just like in previous years of the full-scale war. The reports detail specific strikes on infrastructure in places like Donetsk, Odessa, and Chernihiv.
And these aren't just abstract targets. We saw reports of actual casualties, which really underscores that this is aimed at civilians, at essential services.
Yes, that was explicitly noted. In the Kyiv region, 2 employees from DTEK were wounded when a substation was hit. And DTEK, is Ukraine's largest private energy company. Hitting a substation causes wider outages and injuring the people trying to fix things.
Well, it shows the deliberate nature of these attacks. It's about breaking civilian morale, hurting industry, making winter as hard as possible.
The sheer scale of it is hard to process. President Zelenskyy put out numbers for just the previous week via the platform X. The numbers are, well, quite something. They really suggest a strategy of just overwhelming Ukraine's defenses. For that 7-day period, he reported Russia launched more than 3,100 drones.
3,100 drones in a week.
In a week. Plus 92 missiles and around 1,360 glide bombs.
Wow. What does that mix tell us strategically? Is it just about volume, or is there something about using so many drones and glide bombs specifically?
It tells us a couple of key things, I think. First, the huge number of drones and glide bombs, which are generally cheaper, sometimes slower than advanced missiles. That suggests an attrition strategy. They're trying to force Ukraine to use up its limited and very expensive Western air defense missiles shooting down relatively cheap drones. It's about depleting stockpiles.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, the sheer volume, like you said. It's designed to saturate the air defenses, even if Ukraine has a high success rate, say 80% interception. Well, 20% of over 3,000 drones and hundreds of other munitions getting through is still a lot of hits on scattered targets. It makes repairing the damage incredibly difficult, almost impossible to keep up.
So Zelensky's summary was pretty blunt then.
Yeah, he said, Russia continues its aerial terror against our cities and communities, intensifying strikes on our energy infrastructure. Which, makes the need for more air defense perhaps even more urgent than talk about future offensive weapons like Tomahawks.
So let's connect that back to the diplomacy. Amidst this aerial onslaught, and after all the Tomahawk talk, what actually happened in the follow-up call between Zelenskyy and Trump?
According to Zelenskyy, it was a very productive conversation. The sources say they focused on 3 main things. First, strengthening Ukraine's air defense, which directly addresses the current attacks. Second, improving resilience, which is code for help with the energy sector, fixing things, keeping the lights on. And third, yes, still talking about boosting Ukraine's long-range capabilities. The fact energy resilience was specifically mentioned shows how high up the agenda those current bombings are for Kyiv.
And diplomacy isn't just about weapons, is it? There's the economic pressure angle, too. Was there movement on that front?
Yes, Zelenskyy definitely used the moment to push on sanctions. Specifically, for tighter secondary sanctions against anyone buying Russian oil, he was very clear. Sanctions, tariffs, and joint actions against the buyers of Russian oil, those who finance this war, must all remain on the table.
Why the emphasis on secondary sanctions now? What exactly does that target, and why is it often politically tricky for the U.S. and its allies?
Right, so primary sanctions hit Russian entities directly. Secondary sanctions go after third parties, maybe banks, insurers, shipping firms, often in countries that haven't joined the main sanctions regime who are still helping Russia sell its oil, even with things like the price cap in place. It's tricky because it means the U.S. potentially penalizing companies or even countries that might be allies or important trading partners, trying to force them to stop dealing with Russia. It's essentially policing global trade.
But Kyiv sees it as necessary to really cut off the money funding the war.
Exactly, because the current measures, like the price cap, clearly aren't stopping all the revenue. So they see tighter secondary sanctions as a way to really squeeze the commercial networks that allow Russia to keep financing its military operations. It's economic leverage alongside the military aid.
Okay, before we wrap this up, did the sources give any picture of the actual fighting on the ground beyond the air war?
Briefly, yes. Zelenskyy reported some positive developments from their counteroffensive efforts. He mentioned gains in the south, in the Zaporizhzhia region, and also in the east, in Donetsk. Donetsk region remains the absolute main focus of the ground war. The heaviest fighting is there. Kyiv is reporting they're managing to hold ground and even make some advances, but it's clearly incredibly tough.
And there's more diplomacy happening soon, too.
That's right. The sources confirmed a senior Ukrainian delegation is scheduled to visit the U.S. this week, presumably to follow up directly on all these points: air defense needs, energy sector support, long-range weapons, sanctions, solidifying the details after those high-level calls.
Okay, so when we pull back and look at everything we've discussed in this briefing, what's the core tension here?
I think the core tension is this dangerous symmetry, almost. You have the immediate, very real, quantifiable escalation, those 3,100 drones, the attacks on power stations. That's the certainty of destruction happening right now. And that's being matched by this heightened but still future tense risk of a massive U.S. weapons escalation, the Tomahawk threat. Moscow, reacting with extreme concern, shows the rhetoric is landing, it's having some impact. But clearly it hasn't stopped them from doubling down on their winter bombing campaign. It forces you, the listener, to constantly weigh the potential value of future threats against the very real cost of what's happening today.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over. Building on what we've seen, we heard how leaders like Lukashenko might see these aggressive threats, like the Tomahawks, as just a negotiating tactic, something maybe to be walked back later for political points. So the question is, if this public mulling of game-changing weapons is partly a tactic, how does that political maneuvering actually affect the reality on the battlefield? Does consistently talking tough, even if delivery is uncertain, actually help force a diplomatic outcome? Or could it potentially just give Moscow even more reason to intensify its current campaign, trying to inflict maximum damage before any such weapons might hypothetically arrive? Something to think about as we watch what comes out of that Ukrainian delegation's visit to the U.S. this week.